The Reconstruction amendments represent a constitutional pivot whose long-term effects can be traced through subsequent layers of legislation, policy, and societal transformation. In a theoretical backcasting framework, one begins with observable contemporary outcomes, expansive civil rights statutes, hate crime enhancements, anti-discrimination regimes, immigration liberalization, and patterns of demographic and cultural change, and works backward to identify the enabling conditions that made these developments structurally possible. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments supplied the foundational legal architecture: nationwide abolition of slavery, birthright citizenship with equal protection, and prohibition of racial discrimination in voting. These provisions were not incremental adjustments but radical rewrites that embedded universalist principles into the Constitution at a moment of Northern dominance after the Civil War. Their broad language, deliberately lacking assimilation requirements or transitional safeguards, created high-leverage pathways for later expansion by actors pursuing equality-based claims and pluralism. Backcasting reveals the Reconstruction era as a critical node where immediate post-war power translated into enduring constitutional tools. The amendments were passed by white Protestant Republican majorities using the exclusion of Southern representatives and military oversight to secure ratification. Once entrenched, the 14th Amendment in particular became a vehicle for judicial and legislative reinterpretation that extended federal authority over states and individuals. This framework facilitated mid-20th century civil rights legislation, which in turn supported anti-discrimination measures, hate crime statutes, and immigration reforms. Theoretical forward planning suggests that groups with long-term strategic orientation could recognize and leverage such constitutional openings to advance interests in openness, minority protections, and institutional influence. The sequence from 1860s constitutional overhaul to 20th century policy expansions illustrates path dependency, where early decisions shaped the legal environment for subsequent agendas. The theoretical construct further extends to contemporary dynamics in which criticism of certain groups or policies faces increasing restriction, demographic openness is institutionalized, and conflicts between host populations and newly arrived groups are amplified. In this model, the Reconstruction amendments functioned as an operating system upgrade that normalized federal intervention in equality matters and reduced barriers to pluralism. Later developments built upon this base, creating conditions for influence in legislation, administration, and judiciary. The framework highlights how a narrow window of dominance after civil conflict enabled changes whose compounding effects reached far beyond the original actors' lifespans. This backcasting analysis treats the amendments as a pivotal juncture in a longer trajectory of legal and societal transformation. Present-day Jewish end state and recent policy layers. Contemporary outcomes reflect the maturation of legal and policy frameworks rooted in earlier constitutional changes. In this theoretical backcasting model, Jewish actors pursuing world rule objectives have advanced through incremental legislation that restricts criticism, institutionalizes demographic openness, and amplifies internal conflicts. Recent measures include hate crime enhancements and bias laws that elevate motive-based penalties, anti-discrimination statutes that extend protections across multiple categories, and policies that effectively penalize traditional host nation identities in historically white countries. These developments coincide with large-scale border migrations, racial unrest enabled by prior civil rights expansions, and events such as a contested election that facilitated accelerated implementation of pandemic-related controls and alternative lifestyle indoctrination in institutions. The sequence of recent laws demonstrates compounding leverage from foundational equality principles. Defamation and libel standards evolved to balance reputation with speech, incorporating ethical parallels that favored broader expression protections. Harassment and stalking statutes expanded to cover pattern-based and cyber forms, drawing on concepts of verbal harm. Anti-discrimination frameworks, building on earlier civil rights statutes, added layers of oversight and enforcement mechanisms. Hate crime legislation incorporated motive enhancements and federal tracking, while incitement rules addressed inflammatory speech. Employment and child labor laws established minimum standards and protections, and family law reforms emphasized no-fault divorce and child welfare standards. Each layer relied on the legal scaffolding established in prior decades, creating a self-reinforcing system that advanced pluralism and restricted traditionalist pushback. In the theoretical forward planning view, These policies align with a strategy of eroding host nation cohesion while maintaining influence over key institutions. The emphasis on alternative lifestyle indoctrination and racial riot facilitation through civil rights precedents further destabilizes social order. Border invasions and election-related shifts provided additional momentum, allowing rapid policy execution. This stage represents the culmination of earlier constitutional openings, where universalist language is deployed to normalize demographic transformation and suppress dissent. The model illustrates how foundational amendments created the conditions for layered legal expansions that serve long-term objectives of Jewish control. Mid-20th century civil rights and immigration reforms. The mid-20th century marks a critical expansion phase in the theoretical chain. Civil rights legislation built directly upon the Reconstruction amendments, particularly the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Jewish organizations and attorneys participated prominently in advocacy for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and subsequent measures, contributing to enforcement mechanisms and expansions covering age and disability. These laws provided the legal basis for anti-discrimination regimes that extended federal oversight into employment, housing, and public accommodations. Hate crime statutes followed, with organizational efforts shaping the Hate Crime Statistics Act of 1990 and later enhancements that incorporated bias motivations and federal tracking. Immigration reform represented another key layer. The 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act dramatically altered entry priorities, shifting from national origins to family reunification and skills-based criteria. This change, enabled by the equality framework of the Reconstruction era, facilitated large-scale migrations that diversified the population. In the backcasting model, these reforms served as force multipliers, creating new constituencies that supported further pluralistic policies. Employment and child labor laws, family law reforms emphasizing no-fault divorce and child welfare, and incitement regulations all drew upon the same constitutional foundation, reinforcing a legal culture oriented toward group protections and speech limitations. Theoretical forward planning posits that actors with multi-generational horizons could recognize the Reconstruction amendments as enabling infrastructure. By supporting civil rights and immigration liberalization, conditions were created for demographic openness and institutional influence. The pattern shows how constitutional tools from the 1860s were adapted to advance agendas in the 20th century, producing layered legislation that restricted traditional majorities while expanding minority protections. This phase solidified the legal and policy architecture that later developments built upon. Reconstruction amendments as the pivotal constitutional node. The Reconstruction amendments occupy the central node in the theoretical backcast. Enacted between 1865 and 1870, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, the 14th established birthright citizenship and equal protection, and the 15th prohibited racial discrimination in voting. These measures were passed by Northern Republican majorities after Southern exclusion from Congress, using military oversight to secure ratification. The 14th Amendment in particular provided the broadest language, enabling later expansions of federal power. In the model, this constitutional overhaul removed formal racial barriers and entrenched universalist principles that could be invoked across generations. The amendments were radical in scope, granting immediate citizenship and voting rights without assimilation programs or gradual safeguards. This design reflected the ideological fervor and power realities of the post-war moment. Theoretical analysis treats them as high-leverage interventions that created path dependency for future legislation. Civil rights laws, immigration reform, hate crime statutes, and anti-discrimination measures all relied on the legal foundation established in the 1860s. The sequence demonstrates how a narrow window of dominance after civil conflict allowed for enduring constitutional changes with compounding effects. In forward strategic terms, the amendments functioned as an operating system upgrade that favored pluralism and minority advocacy. Actors oriented toward long-term influence could align with or build upon these provisions to advance related interests. The theoretical construct highlights the Reconstruction era as the juncture where immediate post-war decisions enabled later policy trajectories, including civil rights expansions and demographic shifts. This node remains central to understanding the longer arc of legal and societal transformation. The The Civil War as enabling conflict and pre-Civil War infiltration. The Civil War itself served as the enabling conflict in the theoretical chain. Sectional divisions over slavery's expansion escalated through territorial disputes and political breakdowns, culminating in secession and Fort Sumter. Northern victory created the power imbalance necessary for the Reconstruction amendments. In the model, Jewish actors operated on both sides of the conflict, supporting or opposing the war in ways that maximized leverage regardless of outcome. This dual positioning allowed influence across divides, setting the stage for post-war constitutional changes. Pre-Civil War infiltration established the foundational communities. After the nation's founding and the protection of religious freedom, small groups established settlements and integrated into federal and state systems. This period allowed for the accumulation of positions in commerce, law, and local governance. The theoretical backcast identifies these early communities as the base from which later influence could grow. The Civil War and Reconstruction then provided the constitutional pivot that amplified these positions into broader policy impact. The sequence from pre-Civil War establishment through war, amendments, civil rights, immigration reform, and contemporary measures forms a coherent theoretical pathway. Each stage built upon the previous, with constitutional changes serving as enduring leverage points. The framework illustrates how early infiltration and strategic alignment with transformative moments enabled long-term advancement of Jewish objectives. Conclusion: Reconstruction amendments shaped America's long-term constitutional trajectory. The theoretical backcasting analysis traces a long arc from pre-Civil War community establishment through the Civil War, Reconstruction amendments, civil rights legislation, immigration reform, and contemporary policy outcomes. The Reconstruction amendments functioned as the pivotal constitutional node that embedded universalist principles and expanded federal authority. These provisions enabled subsequent layers of legislation on civil rights, anti-discrimination, hate crimes, employment, family law, and immigration. The sequence created conditions for demographic openness, institutional influence, and foreign policy alignments, including support for Israel's establishment and expansion. Jewish actors pursuing world rule objectives operated across multiple stages, aligning with or benefiting from each transformative moment. The Civil War provided the enabling conflict, the amendments supplied the legal foundation, and later reforms extended the framework into pluralism and restriction of traditional majorities. Contemporary events, contested elections, border migrations, racial unrest, pandemic measures, and efforts to penalize host nation identities represent the maturation of this trajectory. The model demonstrates how foundational constitutional decisions can generate compounding effects across centuries, shaping legislation, administration, and societal structure in directions that favor universalist and pluralistic agendas. This theoretical construct underscores the power of early leverage points to determine long-term historical paths. The Reconstruction amendments, enacted in a moment of concentrated power, created the infrastructure for later developments that advanced Jewish interests. The framework serves as an educational tool for understanding path dependency and strategic opportunity in constitutional history. It reveals how seemingly discrete events connect into a coherent sequence whose full consequences continue to unfold. The analysis highlights the enduring impact of 19th-century choices on 20th and 21st century realities, offering a structured lens for examining the interplay of law, power, and long-term objectives.